The morning dew still clung to the tall grass as Rose made her way through the meadow, wicker basket in hand. The sun hadn't yet peeked over the distant hills, but the 12-year-old was already hard at work. Such was life at the Cromwell mission, where idle hands were considered the devil's playground. Rose pulled her worn shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. Spring had arrived on the calendar, but the early morning chill of 1832 didn't seem to care much for such official declarations. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her face as she bent down to gather kindling for the morning fires. Up before the rooster again? "I see," came a voice from behind her. Rose didn't need to turn to know it was Mrs. Cromwell, the Reverend's wife, standing with hands planted firmly on her wide hips. The woman's face was always pinched in what looked like disappointment, especially when her eyes landed on Rose. "Yes, ma'am," Rose replied, keeping her eyes down. "Thought I'd get a head start on the chores." The sound hung in the air between them. "See that you're back before breakfast bell. Reverend won't abide tardiness even from you. Even from you." The words carried their usual sting. Rose had been at the mission for nearly 7 months, ever since the fever had taken her parents within days of each other. Their small cabin, once filled with her mother's singing and her father's hearty laughter, now belonged to someone else. Rose belonged nowhere except perhaps in this in-between place. Not quite family to the Cromwells, but not quite servant either. "Yes, ma'am," she repeated, and listened to the woman's heavy footsteps retreat back toward the mission buildings. Rose continued her work, moving farther into the woods where fallen branches were more plentiful. The basket grew heavier in her arms, a familiar weight. In the distance, the river that marked the boundary between the settlement and native lands gurgled and splashed, swollen with spring rains. The Reverend's warnings echoed in her head. "Beyond that river lies danger," he would say during his Sunday sermons, his finger pointing westward, voice booming. "Savages who know nothing of God's word or civilized ways." His eyes would always find Rose when he spoke of dangers, as if her orphan status somehow made her more susceptible to straying. But Rose had seen the native people from afar. Sometimes, while hanging laundry on the lines behind the mission, she'd spot them fishing along the distant shoreline. They didn't look like the demons from Reverend Cromwell's tales. They looked like people, mothers watching children, men working together to bring in their catch. A rustle in the underbrush startled her from her thoughts. A rabbit darted across her path, disappearing into the safety of a hollow log. Rose smiled, her first genuine smile of the day. The small creatures of the forest didn't judge her for being parentless or worry that she might have inherited her mother's flighty nature, as Mrs. Cromwell often suggested. The mist rose from the ground as the hidden sun climbed higher. Rose knew she should head back soon, but something pulled her toward the river instead. Just a quick look, she told herself. The basket was nearly full anyway. The path sloped gently downward, bringing her closer to the sound of rushing water. Through the thinning trees, she could make out the river's surface dappled with early morning light. It looked angry today, churning and frothing against the rocks that normally sat higher above the waterline. Rose set down her basket and perched on a boulder, watching the water's hypnotic movement. Here, alone by the river, she allowed herself to remember her parents, her mother's hands always smelling of the wild herbs she collected, her father's eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "You have your father's curious spirit," her mother used to say, usually after finding Rose exploring places she shouldn't be. The memory brought a lump to her throat. The mission bell rang in the distance, the first warning for breakfast. Rose knew she should hurry back, but her feet remained planted by the river's edge. 5 more minutes, she promised herself. 5 minutes of freedom before returning to a place where she was merely tolerated. A thin fog had settled over the river, giving it a mysterious quality. Rose imagined what lay beyond, in the territories she'd been forbidden to even think about. Were there villages like the settlement? Did children her age gather kindling before breakfast too? The snap of a twig pulled her from her daydream. Rose held her breath, scanning the misty shoreline. Nothing moved. Perhaps it was another rabbit or a deer coming for a morning drink. But then she saw it. A flash of movement near a cluster of rocks downstream. Rose ducked behind her boulder, heart hammering against her ribs. The Reverend's warnings thundered through her mind. She should run, should grab her basket and flee back to the safety of the mission. Instead, she found herself creeping closer, staying low to avoid being seen. Through the lifting mist, A figure took shape, small, huddled against the rocks. Not a grown warrior as the Reverend's tales would have her believe, but a girl. A girl who looked to be about Rose's own age, dressed in deerskin clothing adorned with colorful beads. The girl's face was twisted in pain as she clutched at her ankle. Rose froze, unsure what to do. The mission bell rang again, the final call for breakfast. She would be missed now, perhaps even punished for her absence. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. The native girl must have heard something because her head snapped up, dark eyes widening as they locked with Rose's. For a moment, neither moved. Rose saw fear in the girl's eyes, surely mirroring her own, but she also saw something else, pain and desperation. "Hello," Rose said softly, knowing the girl probably wouldn't understand but needing to break the silence somehow. Are you hurt?" The girl spoke rapidly in a language Rose couldn't comprehend, gesturing frantically toward her ankle and then across the river. Rose understood enough. The girl was injured and needed to get to the other side, back to her people. Rose glanced over her shoulder, back toward the mission where Reverend Cromwell would soon be sending someone to find her. She thought of his warnings, of Mrs. Cromwell's disapproving frown, of the rules that governed every moment of her life at the mission. Then she looked at the girl again, at the swelling ankle and the pain etched into her young face. In that moment, standing on the boundary between two worlds, Rose made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, out of her hiding place, and moved slowly toward the injured girl, hands raised to show she meant no harm. "I'm Rose," she said, pointing to herself. "I'll help you." The girl watched warily as Rose approached, her body tense like a deer ready to bolt. But where could she run with that injured ankle? Rose knelt beside her, pointing to the swollen ankle and making a face to show she understood it hurt. Carefully, she reached out. The girl flinched but didn't pull away as Rose gently examined the injury. It wasn't broken, Rose thought, but badly twisted. With simple gestures, Rose indicated the river and then the far bank, raising her eyebrows in question. The girl nodded vigorously, pointing across the water and then making sweeping motions that Rose took to mean her village was not far beyond. Rose helped the girl to her feet, allowing her to lean heavily on her shoulder. The contrast between them was striking. The girl's copper skin against Rose's pale complexion, dark hair against light. Yet in that moment, the differences that adults on both sides of the river found so important seemed meaningless to Rose. The native girl spoke again, touching her chest. "Kimmy," she said clearly. Rose smiled, understanding. "Kimmy," she repeated. "I'm Rose." Kimmy tried the strange name, the sound awkward on her tongue. Both girls laughed, the tension between them easing slightly. As they stood together on the riverbank, Rose knew she was about to break every rule she'd been taught since arriving at the mission. She would miss breakfast and prayers. The Reverend would be furious. Mrs. Cromwell would cluck her tongue and remark how Rose was proving to be just as troublesome as she'd feared. But looking at Kimmy's grateful face, Rose couldn't bring herself to care about the consequences. For the first time since losing her parents, she felt a sense of purpose. This girl needed her help and Rose would provide it, regardless of invisible boundaries drawn by adults who saw the world in terms of us and them. The kindling basket sat forgotten on the shore as Rose helped Kimmy take the first tentative steps toward the river crossing. Whatever lay ahead, Rose knew with certainty that her life would never be the same once she crossed that water. The mission bell fell silent, but a new sound filled Rose's ears, the beating of her own heart, strong and sure, as she chose her own path for the first time since becoming an orphan. The morning mist curled around their ankles as Rose helped Kimmy hobble along the riverbank. The water rushed by, angry and swollen from spring rains, much too dangerous to cross where they stood. Rose pointed downstream where she knew the river narrowed and might offer a safer passage. Kimmy nodded, seeming to understand. Every few steps, Kimmy winced. Her ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin tight and purplish. Rose wished she had some of her mother's herbs to make a poultice, but all she had was her small handkerchief. She gestured for them to stop and knelt by the river's edge, soaking the cloth in the cold water. With gentle hands, she wrapped it around Kimmy's ankle. The native girl's eyes widened at the shock of cold, then softened with relief. "Thank you," Kimmy said in her own language. the words foreign to Rose's ears but the meaning clear in her eyes. Rose smiled and pointed to herself. "Rose," she said again, then pointed to Kimi. "Kimi," the girl repeated, then touched Rose's red-gold hair with wonder, saying something that made her laugh. They continued their slow journey along the riverbank, the mission now well out of sight behind them. Rose knew she'd be in terrible trouble. Reverend Cromwell might even take the switch to her this time. The thought made her stomach twist, but when she looked at Kimi's grateful face, she couldn't bring herself to turn back. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Birds called overhead, and once a fish jumped in the river, making both girls laugh in surprise. Despite their inability to speak each other's language, they developed a simple way of communicating. Kimi taught Rose the native words for river, something that sounded like Minna, and sky, Wakan. Rose shared the English words in return. After nearly an hour of slow progress, they reached a bend in the river where the water narrowed between two large boulders. The current still looked fierce, but at least the distance was shorter. Rose studied the crossing, chewing her lip. Even for two healthy people, it would be challenging. With Kimi's injured ankle, it seemed almost impossible. As if reading her thoughts, Kimi squeezed Rose's hand and pointed to herself, then the river, making a swimming motion. Rose shook her head firmly. The current would sweep away even the strongest swimmer. Rose scanned the shoreline, searching for anything that might help. Her eyes landed on a fallen tree not far from the water's edge. Its trunk was slender enough that she might be able to move it with Kimi's help. She pointed excitedly, tugging Kimi toward it. Together, they dragged the log toward the water, Kimi hopping awkwardly on her good foot. By the time they positioned it near the crossing point, both girls were breathing hard, their clothes smudged with dirt and bits of bark. Rose demonstrated her plan, pretending to walk across the log like a bridge. Kimi's eyes lit up with understanding, but then she frowned, pointing to the gap. The log wasn't quite long enough to span the entire width of the river. Rose wasn't deterred. She found a sturdy branch and showed how they could use it to push off from the riverbed for the final stretch. Kimi looked doubtful but nodded her agreement. They had no better options. With great effort, they pushed the log into position, its end wedged between rocks on their side of the river, the other end extending almost 2/3 of the way across. Rose tested it with her weight. It held, though it bobbed alarmingly in the current. Rose helped Kimi onto the log first. The native girl balanced precariously, her arms outstretched. Rose handed her the branch to use as a walking stick, then climbed on behind her, steadying them both. "Careful," Rose said, the word meaningless to Kimi, but the tone conveying everything. Inch by inch they shuffled forward. The log rolled slightly beneath their weight, and spray from the river soaked through their clothing. Halfway across, Kimi's injured ankle gave way. She cried out, dropping to her knees on the log. Rose lunged forward, grabbing her around the waist before she could fall into the churning water. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of disaster, the current tugging at the log, threatening to roll it. Rose dug her feet in, her arms locked around Kimi. Slowly, they regained their balance. "We can do this," Rose said through gritted teeth. She helped Kimi back to a standing position and pointed to the far shore, so tantalizingly close. With renewed determination, they pressed on. When they reached the end of the log, Rose went first, plunging the branch into the riverbed. The water came up to her chest, the current pulling at her skirts, but the branch held firm. She braced herself against it. "Come on," she called to Kimi, gesturing with her free hand. Kimi slid from the log into the water with a splash. The cold took her breath away. She would have been swept downstream if not for Rose's grip on her arm. Together they fought the current, pushing against the branch, inching toward the shore. Rose's arms burned with the effort. Her lungs screamed for air as a wave splashed over her head, filling her nose and mouth with river water. But she didn't let go. She couldn't let go. With one final desperate lunge, they reached the shallows. They crawled the last few feet to shore, collapsing on the rocky bank, coughing and gasping. Rose lay on her back, staring up at the blue sky, her chest heaving. "We did it," she thought with wonder. "We actually did it." Beside her, Kimi began to laugh, a bright, clear sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. Rose turned her head to look at the native girl, and suddenly she was laughing too. They lay there on the far shore, soaked to the skin and exhausted, sharing a moment of pure joy. When they finally caught their breath, Rose sat up and surveyed their surroundings. They were in native territory now. The forest here looked different somehow, wilder, less touched by human hands. Fear crept back into her heart as she remembered Reverend Cromwell's warnings about bloodthirsty savages. But when she looked at Kimmy, she didn't see a savage. She saw a girl her own age with hopes and fears and a smile that needed no translation. Kimmy touched Rose's arm, pointing deeper into the forest and speaking in her language. Rose understood she was indicating the direction to her village. "How far?" Rose asked, holding up her hands in question. Kimmy pointed to the sun, then made an arc across the sky, stopping about halfway to the western horizon. A half-day's journey, Rose guessed. Her heart sank. There was no way she could help Kimmy all the way to her village and make it back to the mission before nightfall. Mrs. Cromwell would be beside herself. The Reverend might even send out a search party. For a moment, Rose considered turning back. She could help Kimmy find a safe place to rest, maybe bring her food later. But one look at the rushing river behind them settled the matter. There would be no crossing back until the waters receded or they found a better spot. Besides, Kimmy's ankle needed proper care, not just a cold compress. Decision made, Rose helped Kimmy to her feet. They were both still dripping wet, their clothes clinging uncomfortably to their skin. The spring sun provided some warmth, but in the forest shadows a chill lingered. They needed to keep moving. Rose fashioned a better walking stick for Kimmy from a fallen branch, stripping away the smaller twigs to create a smooth support. Kimmy tested it, putting her weight on it gingerly. It wasn't perfect, but it would help. As they prepared to set off into the forest, Kimmy touched Rose's cheek gently. Their eyes met, and 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. In that moment, Rose knew she had crossed more than just a physical boundary. She had defied everything she'd been taught, every warning, every rule, and yet it felt right. "Let's go," Rose said, gesturing ahead. "Let's find your people." Kimmy smiled and taught Rose another word, Toksha, which she later learned meant friend. Together, they limped away from the river, two girls from different worlds united by an act of kindness. Rose glanced back once at the mission side of the river, at the world she knew. Then she turned her face forward toward a new path, a journey that would change both their lives forever. As they disappeared into the shadow of the trees, neither girl noticed the eyes watching them from downstream. Dark, curious eyes that had witnessed their crossing and now slipped away silently to carry news of the strange pale girl who had braved the angry waters to help one of their own. The forest grew thicker as Rose and Kimmy moved away from the riverbank. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, dancing across the forest floor with each breeze. Rose had never ventured this far from the mission before, and certainly never across the river that everyone spoke of as some kind of magical barrier between civilization and wilderness. Yet as she looked around, the wilderness didn't seem so wild. There were paths, subtle but definitely there. Narrow trails that wound between trees and around boulders. Kimmy clearly knew these paths, directing them with gestures and gentle tugs despite her injured ankle. "Your people come here often?" Rose asked, knowing Kimmy wouldn't understand her words but hoping her curious tone would convey the question. Kimmy seemed to grasp her meaning. She nodded, making sweeping gestures toward different parts of the forest, then mimicking picking berries, gathering plants, hunting. "This is where you find food," Rose said, nodding with understanding. It wasn't so different from how she'd accompanied her mother on foraging trips before the fever took her parents away. They moved slowly, due to Kimmy's ankle. Every few minutes they stopped to rest, allowing Kimmy to take the weight off her injured foot. During one such break, Kimmy pulled something from a small pouch tied to her belt, dried berries, dark and wrinkled. She offered some to Rose. Rose hesitated only briefly before accepting. The berries were surprisingly sweet with a tang that made her mouth water for more. She smiled her thanks and Kimmy looked pleased. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth seeping through their still damp clothes. Rose's dress, once a faded blue, now clung to her legs, stained with river water and dirt. Mrs. Cromwell would have a fit if she could see her now. The thought sent a chill down Rose's spine despite the warm day. What would happen when she returned to the mission? Would they even let her return? Her worried thoughts must have shown on her face because Kimmy touched her arm gently, her head tilted in question. Rose forced a smile and pointed ahead. No use worrying about that now. They had to keep moving. As they continued their journey, Rose began to notice differences in the forest. The trees here seemed older, taller than those near the settlement. Wildlife was more abundant too. Twice they spotted deer watching them from a distance before bounding away in graceful leaps. Birds called overhead in voices Rose had never heard before. "Everything's different here," Rose murmured, looking around in wonder. Kimmy followed her gaze and spoke in her language, the words flowing like the river they'd crossed. Though Rose couldn't understand, she heard pride in Kimmy's voice. This was her home, her world, and she was sharing it with a stranger who should have been an enemy. The path began to slope upward, becoming steeper. Kimmy's progress slowed further, her face tight with pain despite her attempts to hide it. Rose wished she knew more about healing plants. Her mother would have known exactly what to look for, which leaves to crush into a poultice, which barks might ease pain. Instead, all Rose could offer was her shoulder to lean on and frequent rest stops. During one such break, she examined Kimmy's ankle again. The swelling hadn't gone down. If anything, it looked worse, the skin an angry red around the purple bruising. Rose frowned and gestured toward a nearby stream. "We should cool it again," she said, mimicking putting water on the ankle. Kimmy nodded gratefully. They made their way to the stream, a small tributary that eventually fed into the larger river they'd crossed. Rose helped Kimmy sit on a flat rock at the water's edge, then gently placed her injured foot in the cool stream. Kimmy sighed with relief, closing her eyes momentarily. Rose took the opportunity to look more closely at the native girl. Her black hair hung in 2 long braids decorated with small wooden beads. Her skin was copper brown, smooth except for a small scar above one eyebrow. Her clothes, though soaked from their river crossing, were beautifully made, soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Rose became aware of her own appearance and felt suddenly self-conscious. Her dress was plain and patched in several places. Her hands were rough from chores. Her hair, usually tied back neatly, had come loose during their river adventure and now hung in tangled waves around her face. As if sensing Rose's thoughts, Kimmy opened her eyes and smiled. She reached out to touch Rose's hair, saying something that sounded like a compliment. Then she pointed to the sun, then to Rose's head, making a connection that Rose understood. Her hair was the color of sunshine. Rose laughed and pointed to Kimmy's braids, miming how beautiful she thought they were. For a moment, they were just 2 girls sharing secrets, the barriers of language and culture forgotten. Their peaceful moment ended abruptly at the sound of a branch snapping nearby. Both girls froze, eyes darting toward the noise. Rose's heart hammered in her chest as she remembered Reverend Cromwell's warnings about wild animals and hostile warriors. A shadow moved between the trees, something large. Rose instinctively moved in front of Kimmy, grabbing a sturdy stick from the ground. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. The bushes parted and Rose held her breath, only to let it out in a relieved whoosh as a large buck stepped into view. The magnificent animal regarded them with liquid brown eyes, unafraid. His antlers spread impressively above his head, catching the dappled sunlight. Kimmy whispered something, her voice filled with awe. The buck continued to watch them for several heartbeats before calmly turning and walking away, disappearing into the forest as silently as he'd come. "He was beautiful," Rose breathed, her hands trembling slightly from the rush of fear followed by wonder. Kimmy nodded, pointing to the deer's path and then to the sky, making some kind of connection that Rose didn't understand. A spiritual meaning, perhaps. Rose had heard that the native people believed animals carried messages from their gods. After Kimmy's ankle had soaked in the cold water for a good while, they continued their journey. The forest began to change again, showing signs of human presence. Rose noticed small clearings where plants grew in 2 neat rows to be natural, gardens of some kind. Twice they passed trees marked with symbols carved into the bark. Kimmy grew more animated as they walked, clearly recognizing these signs. She pointed ahead with increasing excitement despite her pain. They must be getting closer to her village. The path widened, showing more frequent use. Rose's nervousness returned, gnawing at her stomach. What would Kimmy's people think of her? Would they see her as an enemy, a trespasser from across the river? Would they understand she had only wanted to help? As if reading her thoughts, Kimmy squeezed her hand reassuringly. She spoke in her language, the tone clearly meant to comfort. Rose managed a wobbly smile in return. They crested a small hill and Kimmy pointed eagerly. Through the trees ahead, Rose caught glimpses of structures. Dwellings made of wood and animal hides. Smoke rose from several fires curling lazily into the afternoon sky. The village. They had made it. Rose stopped, suddenly uncertain. This was as far as she'd planned, getting Kimmy safely to her people. Now what? Should she leave quickly? Try to make it back across the river before dark? Or would Kimmy's people expect her to stay? Before she could decide, a shout rang out from the direction of the village. A figure emerged from between the trees. A woman whose resemblance to Kimmy was unmistakable. The woman's eyes widened at the sight of the girls, her gaze moving rapidly between her daughter and the pale stranger supporting her. More people appeared behind the woman, their expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. An older man stepped forward, his bearing proud and commanding. He wore a headdress of feathers and carried a staff decorated with symbols similar to those Rose had seen on the trees. Rose's throat went dry. This was clearly someone important, perhaps the village chief or medicine man. His dark eyes studied her intently, missing nothing. Not her mission clothes, nor her strange coloring, nor the way she still held Kimmy's arm, helping her stand. Kimmy spoke rapidly, gesturing to Rose and then to her injured ankle, clearly explaining what had happened. As she spoke, the expressions of the gathered people began to change. Suspicion gave way to curiosity, and in some faces something that looked like reluctant respect. The woman, Kimmy's mother, Rose assumed, stepped forward first, tears in her eyes. She took Kimmy from Rose's supporting arm, embracing her daughter tightly. Then, to Rose's surprise, she reached out and touched Rose's cheek gently, speaking words that needed no translation. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home." The man with the headdress approached next. Up close, Rose could see the lines of wisdom around his eyes, the strength in his weathered face. He spoke to her in his language, voice deep and measured. Kimmy, still held by her mother, translated as best she could with gestures and the few shared words they'd established during their journey. "Father," she said, pointing to the man. "Chief." Rose's eyes widened. Kimmy was the chief's daughter. No wonder there had been such concern over her absence. The chief studied Rose for another long moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled and held out his hand in the settler's greeting, a gesture he must have learned from previous encounters. Stunned, Rose took his hand. Behind him, the village people murmured among themselves, some pointing to the river in the distance, others to Rose's red-gold hair. The village came alive with activity as Rose and Kimmy entered. Children stopped their games to stare wide-eyed at the pale-skinned visitor. Women paused in their work, whispering among themselves. A few old men sitting by a central fire watched with eyes that seemed to look right through Rose, as if measuring her worth. Rose fought the urge to shrink under their gaze. She stayed close to Kimmy, who limped alongside her father, speaking rapidly in their language. Though Rose couldn't understand the words, she caught her own name mentioned several times. The village was nothing like Rose had imagined from Reverend Cromwell's fearsome descriptions. No blood-stained torture posts, no shrieking savages. Instead, she saw neat dwellings arranged in a circle around a central clearing. Some were made of animal hides stretched over wooden frames. Others built more solidly from bark and timber. Smoke rose from cooking fires where pots bubbled with stews that filled the air with unfamiliar but delicious smells. Children played with handmade toys, little figures carved from wood, balls made from animal bladders. Women worked together, some weaving baskets, others scraping hides or grinding corn between stones. Men sat repairing tools or carving new ones, their hands skilled and patient. It was a community, Rose realized. Not so different from the settlement in many ways, just dressed in different clothing and speaking a different tongue. The chief led them to one of the larger dwellings. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious and cool. Furs and woven mats covered the ground. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, filling the air with sweet and spicy scents. An elderly woman waited inside, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp and alert. Kimmy's father spoke to the woman, gesturing to Kimmy's swollen ankle. The old woman nodded and motioned for Kimmy to sit. Rose hesitated by the entrance, unsure if she should stay or go, but Kimmy reached for her hand, tugging her closer. The old woman, a healer, Rose guessed, examined Kimmy's ankle with gentle fingers. She spoke softly, asking questions that Kimmy answered with winces or nods. Then she turned her attention to Rose, looking her up and down with undisguised curiosity. "She wants to know how you found my daughter," Kimmy's father said in halting English that made Rose gasp in surprise. "You speak my language?" she asked, eyes wide. The chief nodded. "Some words. Learn from traders." "Not many." Rose felt a wave of relief. At least they could communicate a little. She described finding Kimmy by the river, showing with gestures how they had crossed using the log. The chief translated for the old woman, whose expression softened as she listened. When Rose finished her story, the woman reached out and patted her hand, speaking in a warm tone. "She thanks you," the chief explained. "Says you have brave heart." The old woman turned her attention back to Kimmy's ankle. She mixed herbs from various pouches, grinding them into a paste, then applied the mixture to the swollen joint. The scent was sharp and medicinal. She wrapped it with soft deerskin, securing it with thin strips of leather. While this was happening, Kimmy's mother brought wooden bowls filled with a rich stew. She offered one to Rose with a shy smile. Rose accepted gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. The stew was delicious, chunks of tender meat and vegetables she didn't recognize in a thick, savory broth. "Good?" asked the chief, watching her eat. Rose nodded enthusiastically. "Very good." He seemed pleased by her answer. "You helped my daughter. Now you are friend." The word warmed Rose more than the stew. How long had it been since anyone had called her that? At the mission, she was just the orphan girl, tolerated but never truly welcomed. As they ate, Rose became aware of the fading light outside. Dusk was approaching. She thought of the mission with a twist of anxiety in her stomach. They would be looking for her by now. Reverend Cromwell might even have organized a search party. The chief noticed her worried glance toward the door. "You think of going back?" Rose nodded. "They'll be worried. I should try to cross the river before dark." He shook his head firmly. "River dangerous now. More rain coming." He pointed to his eyes, then to the sky, indicating he could read the weather signs. "You stay. Go tomorrow when safe." Rose wanted to protest but knew he was right. The river had been treacherous in daylight. In the gathering darkness, it would be deadly. Besides, she could already hear the distant rumble of thunder. Another storm was coming. Seeing her resigned nod, Kimmy's mother spoke to her husband, who translated. "My wife says you sleep here." With Kimmy, Rose smiled gratefully. The chief's family left to make arrangements, leaving Rose alone with Kimmy and the old healer. The woman was packing up her medicines, humming softly to herself. Kimmy, looking sleepy from whatever herbs had been in the paste, patted the space beside her, inviting Rose to sit closer. Outside, the first fat raindrops began to fall, drumming on the roof of the dwelling. The sound was oddly comforting. Rose felt the tension drain from her shoulders as she settled beside Kimmy. For tonight, at least, she was safe. The old woman finished her work and left, but not before pressing something into Rose's hand, a small carved figure of a bird. A gift. Rose clutched it tightly, strangely moved by the simple gesture. Through the rain-muffled sounds of the village settling for the night, Rose heard singing from a nearby dwelling, a deep, rhythmic chant that seemed to rise and fall with the storm outside. Kimmy, seeing her interest, explained in gesture and the few shared words they had established that it was a prayer for healing and protection. As the evening deepened into night, more villagers came to peek into the dwelling, curious about their unexpected visitor. Some brought small gifts, a handful of berries, a prettily woven bracelet, a smooth stone with unusual markings. Each smiled or nodded at Rose, no longer regarding her with suspicion. One young boy, about 6 years old, was bolder than the rest. He marched right up to Rose and touched her hair, then burst into delighted giggles and ran away. His mother, looking mortified, apologized with gestures, but Rose just laughed. Soon Kimmy was laughing too, and the awkwardness melted away. Later, as they lay on soft furs listening to the rain, Rose found herself thinking about the mission. Would they welcome her back after this? Or would Reverend Cromwell see her actions as unforgivable? She had crossed the forbidden river, entered native territory, accepted food and shelter from people he had always described as enemies. But how could they be enemies when they had shown her nothing but kindness? How could she fear people who shared their food and offered gifts to a stranger? Beside her, Kimmy was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. Rose watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, thinking how different things might have been if she had passed by that morning, if she had pretended not to see the injured girl by the river. One small choice, one moment of courage had changed everything. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Wind rattled the dwelling, and rain pounded against the hide roof. But inside it remained warm and dry. Rose's eyelids grew heavy. Just before sleep claimed her, she thought she heard wolves howling in the distance, their cries mingling with the storm's fury. Morning came with startling brightness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean. Rose woke to find Kimmy already up, sitting beside her with an excited expression. "What is it?" Rose asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Kimmy pointed outside, then made walking motions with her fingers. Rose understood immediately. They were going somewhere. The chief entered the dwelling, nodding a greeting to Rose. "You come," he said. "Important to see." Curious, Rose followed him outside. The village was already busy with morning activities, but there was an undercurrent of tension Rose hadn't noticed the previous day. People spoke in hushed voices, casting glances toward the forest. The chief led her to the edge of the village, where a group of warriors had gathered. Their faces were painted, and they carried spears and bows. Rose felt a flutter of fear until she realized they weren't looking at her with hostility. One warrior stepped forward, speaking rapidly to the chief while pointing toward the river, toward the mission. The chief's expression grew grave as he listened. "What's wrong?" Rose asked, her fear returning. The chief turned to her. "Men from your side of river. Many men with guns. Looking for you." Rose's heart sank. A search party, just as she'd feared. "I have to go back," she said. "I have to explain." The chief studied her face. "They not understand why you helped my daughter?" Rose thought of Reverend Cromwell's stern face, of Mrs. Cromwell's disapproving frown. "No," she admitted. "They won't understand." For a long moment the chief was silent, considering. Then he spoke to the warriors in their language. They listened intently, nodding at his words. "My best warriors will go with you," he told Rose. "Show your people that you are safe." "That we are not enemies." Rose stared at him in disbelief. "You would do that?" "They might not welcome your warriors. They might be afraid." The chief smiled slightly. "Sometimes fear must be faced. You faced River to help my daughter. Now we face your people to help you." His words filled Rose with a strange mixture of gratitude and dread. What would happen when the warriors of the village met the men of the mission? Would there be understanding or bloodshed? As if reading her thoughts, the chief placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No weapons," he said. "We go in peace."